now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. Dr. Antonia Dardere holds the Levy Presidential Endowed Chair in Ethics and Moral Leadership in the School of Education at Loyola Marymount University, and is also Professor Emerita of Educational Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her scholarship focuses on issues of racism, political economy, social justice, and education. Her work critically engages the contributions of Paulo Freire to our understanding of social inequalities in schools and society. Dardere's critical theory of biculturalism links notions of culture, power, and schooling, as well as cultural issues to the brain, testing, and inequality. In recent scholarship on ethics and moral questions of education, she articulates a critical theory of leadership for social justice and community empowerment. She is the author of numerous books and articles in the field, including Culture and Power in the Classroom, that is celebrating its 20th anniversary edition, Reinventing Paulo Freire, A Pedagogy of Love, and A Dissonant Voice, Essays on Culture, Pedagogy, and Power. She is co-author of After Race, Racism After Multiculturalism, and co-editor of The Critical Pedagogy Reader and Latinos and Education, A Critical Reader. We are so pleased to have you with us today, Antonia. Please help me to welcome her.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be with you today. Thank you so much, Deborah, for the invitation. Thank you for all of the work that you are doing. I'm not sure, are you able to hear me all right? Yeah? Okay, great. I'm really, really happy to be with you today. So let me get going. The first thing I want to tell you that this was a cartoon from one of the Dean's Compact network lists. No, it was one of your, I think, oh my God, newsletters or something, right? Anyway, and so I looked at this, and for some reason it's amazing, you know, they say little cartoon, but what I really got to know about what the work that you all are doing is that there really is this vision or this intent in terms of the preparation of all children and all educators to teach and support all learners, all children in schools, and to engage the bureaucratic difficulties. So there's a sense, like, you know, there's bureaucratic difficulties that people are facing, that there's a need to integrate new perspectives. I think that it was like unpleasant truths and the stuff I agree with, you know, which may or may not be together at times, or to be willing to be in the room and to do the work. I mean, that struck me as such an important piece of this little cartoon, right? To be fully present, including our emotions. And of course, it's a little, you know, a little figure that's tears coming out of the emotions. And I thought, yes, that's exactly how we have to show up with all of ourselves, and to create a state community of practice across common cause, a common sense of understanding, which seems to be so missing in our society these days, and to use, you know, state grants as a means to create a critical understanding of accountability, and to avoid academic silos in the sense of not being the disability group, but being the group about human rights, and a group that is about inclusivity, truly about inclusivity. And so those things made me feel like, oh, okay, I understand why I'm here. So, with that said, some of the challenges that I think that we face in enacting inclusivity include the lack of connection and integration across K-12 and PhD. I mean, there's a tendency to look at education in these very fractured ways. And so the consequence is that we don't see how they're linked, how what happens for children from the time that they enter school has an impact on them throughout their journey in education. That we have an expert model, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and that there's a tendency to have a kind of arrogance and paternalism that sometimes is linked to the kind of expert model. The bandage, or what Freire called fossilizing approach to address inequalities, where you only look at one symptom of that inequality and you kind of put everything around there, but you're not looking at what caused those inequalities. What are the ways that we're thinking that keep reproducing that inequality, even when we say we want to do things differently. That we have at times a very fragmented and abstract curriculum and teacher preparation, that there's some real issues around teacher preparation that we just cannot seem to get a handle on. And I think part of it has to do that as long as we keep thinking of teachers as technicians rather than as intellectuals and educational leaders, this is the kind of curriculum we're going to have. Education has become a kind of economic engine rather than a humanizing project, and all of these you'll see as I keep moving, and that there continues to be an exclusionary and hierarchical epistemology that is part of the problem that we face. So with that, I think I want to talk to you just quickly about some major assumptions that I make when I think about this question. And one is that we really need to think about this issues of disability, around what Brandon Gleason calls geographies of disability. And this points to our ability to examine the relationship between the geographical environment and complex and fluid interactions with the nature of individuals' impairment. That society functions to either include or marginalize people with disabilities. There is a need to understand the history and landscape of disabled people's experience from the urban to the rural, and our work must engage issues of disablement, a range of social and political and cultural factors, and the complex interactions between power, space, and materiality. That we need to understand the intersectionalities of oppression. This is an assumption that I come to you, and it's a sense that we've got to understand how these different forms of oppression that exist within society, including ableism, run very much similar courses. And that if we just look at one form of inequality, at one form of oppression, and don't understand that they're all linked in different ways, in the ways that we think, which produce exclusion, social exclusion and material exclusions, then the consequence is that we can be engaging one aspect, but not to understand that it's linked to the others doesn't allow us to do the kind of work that moves across society around all exclusions. That we need to move beyond what Paulo Freire called the banking education, and some of you who have read him know what I'm talking about, but that there's this hierarchical and very authoritarian approach that is often shrouded in kind of a benevolence, but it's still very hierarchical, and there's a sense that the teacher comes in, knows what the student needs, the parents don't have much say, the community doesn't have much say, and then all the teacher needs to do is fill the little brains, fill the brains of the kids, and what happens is, in the knowledge that happens outside of schools is negated, it's marginalized, it's ignored. And then what we have often is kind of a bandage or reform mentality that unfortunately is the outcome of a banking methodology, which causes us to just look at a particular symptom rather than looking at the phenomenon that exists and that allows such a condition to occur. We very much need to move beyond deficit thinking. I mean, there's just these ways in which deficit thinking moves across all forms of inequality. We need to shatter the limiting assumptions of normalcy and deficit. Ableism we have to understand it as a form of deep discrimination, and that there's a false idea that disabled people are by default inferior. I mean, that there's just that notion. In the same ways that we think that if a person's skin is black, that somehow there's a deficit there, or they're Latino or Chicano, there's a deficit there. And there's ways in which those are default. And what I mean by default ways of thinking is the ways in which inequalities and forms of racism and exclusion don't necessarily work on the conscious level. And that's part of the struggle. They work on the subconscious level. So, and when we look at some of the work that's being done in neuroscience, part of what we're finding is that people's responses, even your response right now to anything I say, is 95% more linked to your unconscious beliefs and values than it is that conscious side of yourself, that 10% of the conscious side, that you have access to, that we have access to. We don't want to believe that, because we want to believe that we can master everything, that somehow we're in control of everything. But that's part of the issue that we're struggling with in our work. We need to then move beyond the tyranny of labeling, because this issue of labeling, at times it's helpful. We know that you can't get money without using labels, so then it becomes very linked to an economic language. But labels tend to essentialize and obscure the humanity of students. This includes both positive and negative labels. They're found to reinforce expectations. And students seen as the other are often labeled by teachers as hyperactive or high risk or slow learners or troubled. It's like Black and Latino kids often, especially boys, teachers will talk about them in diagnostic ways, as if they're somehow, that child is just so hyperactive. He's got ADHD or what. And the child's never even been diagnosed. There isn't any sense that maybe epistemologically how that child engages with the world may be different than the expectations that are set up in classrooms that are very Eurocentric. So part of our struggle then is, how do we move beyond that so that we understand that often when I've spoken to students who later become educated, but who ended up in classrooms for disabled children, they had physical disabilities. They did not have a cognitive disability, and yet they were perceived as having a cognitive disability. And if it wasn't for somebody, for a parent or an educator who kind of saw the glimmer in that child would have had a completely different life. They would have grown up into a completely different world. I have a graduate student right now who talks about her story of coming from Iran, having a degenerative bone condition, and what that did to her life during the first 10 years. It took 10 years before they finally got her into the right educational program for her. We need to move then beyond this dehumanizing language that's often used. I love this little piece that a young woman wrote, where she says that if you see the person, not this disability, you're only getting half of the picture, right? So we have to broaden our perspective. But she wrote, where she was told, "Oh, you have beautiful eyes." And so she writes, "Blindness is a marker of physical difference. This is written on my body. It designates my body as especially vulnerable, perhaps unusual, not fit to be in public. The dude who told her she had beautiful eyes, has identified and then immediately fetishized the marker of difference. He thinks he's totally made by my day." We need to move beyond this issue of objectification. In any form of inequality, in any form of social exclusion, it is impossible to exclude a person unless you make them into an object that can be moved. And so you look at the work of Aimé Césaire, who talked about the relationship of objectification and what he called thingification as linked to colonization. And you're going to wonder, what does that have to do with it? I'm getting to it. But Freire spoke about that to alienate human beings from their own decision-making is essentially to change them into objects. So whenever decisions are made for us, that have to do with our labor, with our work, with the quality of our life, and we don't have any say about it, at that moment we are experiencing a process of objectification. And this happens for kids all the time. It happens for teachers all the time. We need to move beyond silencing, where the voices and participation of those that are seen as other remain absent and omitted from the spheres of power and decision making. We need to move beyond fostering dependency. I think that this cartoon always cracks me up, right? Yeah, I want you to be independent, critical thinkers, but to do exactly what I want you to do. And this, of course, then, especially in the work that we're doing, to move beyond solutions that reinscribe oppression. So I love this, and maybe you're familiar with this particular cartoon by Scott Chambers, who is an activist around issues of disability, and it captures what I think is the irony of many disabled people's experience. That is the irony of drowning in help that is oppressive. So you look at the first, the first slide, and this distressed man, is calling help, and the next thing you know, there's this wheelchair that is thrown at him. The wheelchair lands on the man's head, and they both sink into the sea. The second one, the distressed man is floundering and calls for help, and next the man looks up with a smile because there's this money flying, down, and the money's floating from the sky. But in the final scene, the man still drowns with money floating all around because money wasn't necessarily what was needed. The last shows a distressed man again in the sea, crying out for help. And this time, help comes in the form of this big, heavy book that's entitled A Report on Drowning, flying down from the sky. The book hits the man on the head, and, and then the book, he drowns and the book is floating, which I think, so the moral of the story, of course, there are not too many reports on drowning. There are too many reports on drowning and not enough life preservers. That is, help isn't help if it's not helpful, and help that is not help can actually oppress. More importantly to all of this, we cannot figure out the help that is needed without engaging in very, very consistent ways those who need help. And the tendency is that piece, because we think we're the experts, is left out. So all of these challenges are institutionalized. I mean, they're not just floating out there. They're not just, that some individual does them. They are institutionalized in all sorts of ways, in ways that we're not even necessarily conscious of. And what we need to think of is in contrast to the medical model of this kind of individual deviancy paradigm of disability, that the social oppression paradigm can help us in that it reminds us that society's view and response to disability creates problems and barriers that disabled persons encounter, whether they are physically, sensory, intellectual, or emotional impairments, or long-term illnesses. So critical here is the manner in which institutional power is implicated in perpetuating conditions of social exclusion and material inequalities. And this also speaks then to practices of institutional oppression that have generated lack of public confidence and distrust for education in this country. I think that we have to understand that especially among disenfranchised people, there are ways in which folks don't trust education. And so we can't pretend that that isn't a challenge for us and that, we can blame the public for that. But we've got to think about what has been going on, what is a history of communities that no longer trust educators, trust teachers, trust the system. With this, then, I want to think, about how do we deal with what is at times a very dismal political climate and economic uncertainties that we're facing during this time. So one of the pieces that we have to deal with is how capitalism continues to be a totalizing force that cuts across all oppressions. And in different ways, if we don't look at the question of the economy, we can talk about, I want to fight against ableism or against, racism or against sexism, or against any of the forms of inequalities. But if we don't look at the material ways in which people are oppressed, which has to do with a political economy, for example, that absolutely necessitates poverty. I mean, and people, you can look, I mean, when I say that, people sometimes like, what are you talking about? We have a political economy that necessitates a large portion of our population to be impoverished. It is a hierarchical form a political economy. And it is set up under rules and ethics that actually perpetuate inequality. More recently, we see this through the kind of flat world notion of neoliberalism, that somehow, things have become flat and everybody has an opportunity to everything, right? And usually the people saying this are the people with the opportunities, not the people who don't have them. But when we talk about neoliberalism, it's really understanding that part of what we're struggling with is the rule of the marketplace, an ethos where entrepreneurial competition is what is going on. I mean, like, for example, where this whole issue of education, privatization of education, I mean, that didn't just come from anywhere. That came from a particular way of deciding that we were going to use the economy and we were going to use education as a way to create profit. Cutting public expenditures for social services so that at the same time we have a cutting of the safety net. So those who are the most in need often don't receive the services that they need. The deregulation to maximize corporate profits, the privatization of public goods, which abdicates states' responsibility. I mean, at the point that education is no longer a public good, that now it's a product that you buy and sell, it changes our relationship then to education. To eliminate the concept of the common good altogether, or the sense of community. For me, these are the issues that we have been struggling with, and there have been consequences to neoliberalism. For example, when we look internationally, the impact of globalization, what we see is a growing trend around the world of poverty, including increasing poverty in the United States. We see the issue of incarceration. And if you look at this particular, I know Art told me there was a way to do this, and let me see if I can do it. Did you say do it twice? You don't see my little light, right? If you go to right around the mid-'80s, that's when neoliberal policies in education and across the country and labor, within the labor market, that's when neoliberal policies really begin to rev up. Then you look, a couple of decades later, and one of the consequences has been the increase in the incarceration, which continues today, the increase of incarceration. When we look, and another slide that I don't have is CEO salaries. You have this kind of thing, but it's CEO salaries. So we have to begin to think, we can't just look at one factor, we need to look at the different elements that are at work and how they're having an impact on people, because this speaks about issues of social control. So at this point, we have to think about how has incarceration been used then as a form of social control. So then, neoliberalism has touched education. So suddenly education is a business. So many school districts, we used to have educational leaders, people who had a vision of education. That's who we had in school districts. Now, the prime candidate is a CEO. So now, suddenly, school districts are being run as if they were corporations. And I think that we have suffered for that. The issue of meritocracy is just, gone mad in this country. It has just gone mad. We see this intensification of meritocracy, which denies the gross inequalities that marginalized students are facing in the process of their education. We have structures of accountability that are linked, managerialism, measurement, evidence-based. These are words that are constantly there. A kind of surveillance, economic logic and language that's used. Again, the sense of what we need now is economic solutions to human problems. The consequences is there's this kind of pretense that we have this level playing field, right? And we see it in relationship particularly to issues of testing and how different, for example, the lives of children who live in very wealthy communities are in comparison to children who live in very marginal communities. The conflict of interest then ensues. So you have this conflict of interest when people are calling for change. in relationship to where the money is. So you're going to have folks in conflict, and we wonder, why is there such conflict? Why is there such contentiousness? I think that if we close our eyes to it, we really do ourselves a disservice, not just in terms of our own individual lives, but our lives as citizens out in the world. We have to deal then not with the notion of political correctness, because this is part of the problem that happens, is that once we start speaking, then people say, oh, the issue is, they're just, there's a political correctness going on here. We have to be careful about how we speak. And I think that completely loses the notion that when we look at what's going on, the actual intent is to transform values and beliefs and language and structure and policies and relationships that keep reproducing the social inequalities, particularly in this case for disabled people. But it is across the board. Often when people speak up, they're considered to be endangered. So this comes from my student, Sofia Beguera, who just finished her EDD. She has cerebral palsy, has been in a wheelchair since a tiny, tiny little kid. She did a beautiful autoethnography about her life as a person with disabilities, but also trying to be a leader with disabilities. And the tendency was that the only thing that she could talk about was about disabilities. It's like if you're a person of color, like the only thing you can talk about is about racism, or children of color or something, as if we don't have other areas that we are thinking about and trying to make some sense of. So I think that she came. And on top of that, she said often people seem to like her better when she didn't speak up for herself as a disabled woman. That when she started speaking up for herself, then she was made the exception. So all of this then really puts us in a place to think about what are we doing and who we are that work in these fields, right? And I love this, please, charity jobs are us. And that is linked to what Sophia was saying, where she said that we have to be self-vigilant of our intent and the reasons for doing the work that we do on behalf of others to prevent being an obstacle to their self-determination. And this requires owning our privilege and using it in the interests of democratic life. So it's not that we should feel bad about the ways that we are able. It means that how do we use that in ways that actually help everyone. It is, if you have money, I don't want you to feel guilty about that. I want you to think about how to use your money in ways that create more opportunities for others. Here, we have to stay cognizant, and most of you in the room, I would hope, are cognizant about the issues related to ability privilege, that we can expect to be included in groups and activities, that public transportation and air travel is easy for us. I can't tell you the number of stories that I've heard in terms of horrendous issues around travel. That if you get hired, people don't assume it's because you have a disability, and so they're kind of feeling sorry for you, and somebody are going to help you, and that you don't face job discrimination. I had another student who had a disability, and when she went to Teach for America to apply, she was essentially told that they really weren't going to be able to accommodate her, So you can, we constantly have to remember that these are real experiences. These are experiences that people have in the flesh every single day. And that often, if we don't have those experiences, it's easy for us to forget. So we need to move beyond the notions also that inclusion can be solved by simply visible or numerical measures. Let's use measures where they need to be measured, but don't think that measures equals equality. This has been a piece that I have been fighting for a long time because of the ways in which it in fact reproduces at times inequalities, and it creates invisibility. So we need to disrupt then what I call these colonizing epistemologies and gaze that persist in our society. And so this is how the colonizing element that we don't realize and we don't think about in terms of our epistemology, the way we make knowledge, the way we understand the world. That ableism can be linked to the colonization of the body. Given the manner in which disabled populations have been historically separated, isolated, and contained, we can link ableism to the process of colonization, particularly with respect to the ways in which the body is colonized. And there's all sorts of ways in which human beings, are dealing with our bodies, within education in particular. Often there's this sense that education is simply a cognitive process, and there isn't any engagement of the fact that our bodies are implicated in our learning. And nowhere is that more the case than with children who have physical disabilities. So when I talk about this, moving beyond, we have to move beyond certain elements in terms of Western epistemologies that are privileged, that is a kind of scientism that keeps us in our place. Like we believe that if somebody, and the advertisers know this already. They know that all they need to do is put a lab coat or say scientifically proven or something. It doesn't have to be true. But people will buy it. People will believe that it is so. And the reason why is because we have been colonized to believe that anything that comes out of science must somehow, be legit. We have here a way of thinking that creates this kind of neutral distance between knowledge and whatever it is that we're studying, that we're supposed to be somehow objective. That there's a sense of either or. It's either this way or it's that way. There's a kind of reductionism. There's a sense that there's an absolute truth, that truths are universal, that everybody experiences truths the same way, that there's such a thing as objective truth, as if somehow there's this truth that's out there, just dangling, and it's true anywhere and everywhere you go. And there's a sense of the mastery over nature. So this epistemology is great for conquest. It's great for sifting and sorting and mastery, the sense of mastering. It is not such a good epistemology when it comes to dealing with the human needs of our people. What it does is create what's called an abyssal divide. This is created then by an epistemological thought that Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls, what he calls it the abyssal divide, but this is what he says about it. What most fundamentally characterizes abyssal thinking is the impossibility of the co-presence of two sides of the line. Beyond it, there is only non-existence, invisibility, non-dialectical absence. Now, what he's saying there is that the things that we believe to be true, if somebody doesn't believe them to be true, we tend to then make them invisible or irrelevant. And as a consequence, at the point that we do that, when we do that, what we're doing in essence is that we're shutting down that knowledge. We participate in a kind of death of knowledge. So whatever that may have contributed to our understanding of a phenomenon or a society or community or a school or a classroom gets lost. And part of this is linked to a way of thinking that has just been part of the history of the society in which we live. Colonizing values that continue are kind of these Eurocentrisms when people don't even realize that they're being Eurocentric. Victim blaming, where you blame the victim for the problem they have. If they, the sense of detachment from community, the sense of individualism, that everything's about the individual. So how assessments are done are completely individualistic. There's never a sense that a child, if put in another context, in another situation, might have very, very different ways of responding to the world. They focus on consumption and accumulation, separation from nature, and the notion that somehow there's some kind of a cycle of poverty, and that's why that's what's wrong with those people. They could just get out of the cycle of poverty. But there's no questioning about who the hell is creating the cycle of poverty to begin with. So part of what I want to say is that, believe it or not, we're still somewhat anchored into this eugenics, this kind of this whole element that particularly in the 30s, I don't know if you were, there was a human betterment society, and their notion was that we had to get rid of all of these people who were dumb, who couldn't move, who were burden to society, right? And that the way we needed to do it is to make sure that they were sterilized and that somehow, they didn't reproduce. So what we don't realize is that often the ways in which we think about testing is very much comes from the history of eugenics. So we somehow have a kind of historical amnesia because that ahistorical element is also part of what drives our society. So it's not unusual for people to believe in the survival of the fittest. Social and economic Darwinism for conquest and control that is what is at work here. And it cannot be missed that there's an economic determinism that undergirds then the perspective and perpetuation of certain ways of structuring organizations and certain ways of structuring our society. This then causes enormous epistemological tensions because we feel dehumanized. And often people feel dehumanized and are not even aware, like you have these tensions and you're not aware, like why am I having these tensions? There is in a sense that the context in which you're in, the way that you're being perceived, maybe even the way you're supposed to do the work is actually problematic. So we need to start engaging those because when we have those tensions, they suppress our sensibilities. So everybody sitting in this room, you come from a particular history. You have certain lived experiences. You have certain ways of thinking about the world. I'm not going to say, look, your way is wrong, or right. That's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is that we get a real sense of what it is that we think and that we engage as communities to think about what are the consequences of our ways of thinking. How might we create commonality if we are not willing then to think more deeply about the consequences of our own belief systems? The suppression of sensibilities then creates this fragmenting and fracturing of our human faculties. So what often happens, people will feel confused, students will feel confused, there'll be self-doubt, insecurity, disconnection, alienation. And instead of thinking that there's something larger going on than the individual, it's instead, let's get that kid to the shrink. Let's bring a psychologist in here to deal with them. What I'm saying is psychology, a psychologist is not what we often need. So what all of this takes us to is, and really, how do we move towards decolonizing our minds? How do we decolonize our minds? I mean, it's a real task, let me tell you. As somebody who has been doing this work for 35 years, it's a real task. Because after 35 years, I could come in a room like this and half of the people might think what I'm talking about, I have 5 heads. I might as well have 5 heads. And you would think, how can we have been doing this work for so long and trying to get people to understand issues of inequality and exclusion in deeper ways, and yet some of these ideas still feel so uncomfortable to people? I want to say that we need to move towards a praxis of inclusivity and empowerment, and we need to think of those together. You cannot, why do we want inclusion if it is not about issues of empowerment, about participation, about democratic life? What do we want to empower? Why are we interested in the issue of empowerment? And more importantly, do we understand that none of us can empower anybody? That what we can do is work with one another and create spaces for children to find that empowerment in themselves, for us to work to create conditions of empowerment within our organizations, within our schools, and within our society. To do this, I firmly believe that we need to move towards a decolonizing epistemology, which says then that we have to understand that power and culture are always implicated. Power is always at work. And wherever you have human beings, the issue of power is going to be at work. And so much of how we create harmony in the world is how we learn to navigate power in democratic ways, in respectful ways. We need to do this relationally. We have relationships with one another. You may feel like I don't know who this woman is. I don't know this woman from Adam, right? You might engage with me that way, and I could engage with you that way. Or I could engage with you to think, these are my brothers and sisters. They live in a different context. They live in a different place. They're struggling with different issues. But they too are trying to figure out how to create a better world. It's a very different way than creating that kind of otherness because I don't happen to live in the Midwest at this point, you know. We need a fluid way of creating knowledge, understanding that knowledge is fluid, that it's contextual, that different contexts, the truth is multifaceted depending on what conditions we're in, what situations we're dealing with. We're going to have multiple truths at work, that it is communal, that we are interdependent, knowledge is interdependent, and that through this connection, is that we have the possibility of creating, humanizing, and empowering communal life together. The context is essential then. We have to think about rather than trying to create a one-size-fits-all, which is part of the struggle that we're dealing with, is we've got to understand that, in fact, we have to know the context. There's no shortcuts in this work. And often I feel like people are looking for shortcuts. And in 35 years, I can tell you, I have never found shortcuts. It's the people that try to create shortcuts that reproduce the problems, the exclusions that we're trying to work against, because it requires that kind of willingness to be present with our work. In this sense, then we can think of principles for inclusivity, right? So we can talk about equity. So this issue of openness to one another and to learning from our failures, being transparent, understanding that we all make mistakes, that we all have to, kind of work to understand each other. We shouldn't just assume that we understand each other, that we have to come to the work with commitment, with discipline, a kind of critical accountability, to go the extra mile. And in this sense, we build trust and faith in ourselves and others. And it isn't just about having faith in other people. Because if I don't have faith in myself, how can I really have faith in you? If I don't have faith in myself. It's just what we often talk, if I don't love myself, how can I really love somebody else? It begins with ourselves and it extends out into community. And I think that that's what we've got to learn in this process if we truly are genuine about wanting a more inclusive society. That the quality has to do when interventions are, that the interventions that are effective are those that meet the needs of our students. That solidarity is necessary. By solidarity, I mean this sense of interdependence, faith in self and others again, that we build connections together, and all of this in terms of community collaboration, ethical relationships, compassion, empathy, respect, the dignity, we respect the dignity of others, and we engage with love and humility. In this process, what we have to understand that is in this issue of empowerment is that is what many of us call a dialectical process, that there's always a tension. So there's always a tension between what is good for the individual and what is good for the collective. It's not a bad thing. It is a necessary piece, but that we need both. That somehow we have to be able to find ways to meet the needs of individual students, but we also have to know how to meet the needs of communities. And that has to do with the issue of self-determination. So my self-determination, the way I see it, I don't have a right to self-determination if my self-determination means your oppression. That's the kind of relationship that we have to be willing to establish in our work and with each other. And so for this, I talk about critical praxis, this reflection and dialogue and action, that this is continuous. It never stops. There isn't an end point. Sometimes there's this notion that somehow we're going to get there. We're going to get to empowerment. To me, empowerment is a way of life. It is not like a place we get to and then we're done. We will always have to be working around these questions because we are human beings. We are in society. We are in community. And most of us struggle with big old egos, that get in the way. So until we learn how to bring, some greater consciousness to ourselves, the more consciousness we have about our interdependence, the more capacity we have to work with each other in the process. We need to tackle then these material inequalities in the flesh. We have to understand that all inequalities are experienced in and manifested through our bodies and our relationships with others. Therefore, we need to also move towards a pedagogy of the body, but that recognizes the body as central to teaching and learning. In this way, we can expand notions of normalcy and inclusivity. And nowhere is this more important than in the work with disabled children and students. This then calls for the integration of our faculties, our human faculties. And when I use the term human faculties, what I'm saying is that I may see you as a body sitting out there, each of you, these bodies. But what I know is that you're a lot more than just the body. You're a body, you've got a mind, you've got a heart, you're a spirit. These are the faculties, the different powers that we have as human beings. And what often happens is rather than they being integrated, they become disintegrated, which is what we call mental illness, by the way, when people cannot bring all of themselves together. And I think that part of our work is to think about how we do our work, how we labor in education, so that in fact we're not perpetuating fragmentation and alienation, but instead are working towards the integration of our minds, hearts, bodies, and spirits. And this then means that we need a praxis that is anchored in ethical and moral commitment, that human existence is in fact, according to Freire, a radical and profound tension between good and evil, between dignity and indignity, between decency and indecency, between the beauty and the ugliness of the world. And what helps us to deal with the tensions of those elements is the relationships which we establish with others. So in this process of decolonizing praxis, and I'm talking about a praxis that informs our leadership, our pedagogy, our research, and our policies to promote then practices that enhance our humanity, that support voice, social agency, participation, and solidarity for actualizing very real changes on the ground, changes that are not only seen, but that are felt and experienced in people's everyday life. With this, we need to think about this question of working with, and I love this particular quote is from Leela Watts, who's about Aboriginal woman, and I know it's just doing its own little thing here, but she said, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. It's going to mess me up, right? But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Such a difference when we engage the world that way. I'm not here to help you. I'm here to be with you and to work with you. Philosophical keys, this is when people fall asleep, but it's okay. We have to, because they're at work, and these are the things we don't talk about. We have a way in which we think about human nature. We have a way about how we create knowledge. We have a methods, the methodologies that we use. All of these are implicated when we're talking about inclusivity. So we need an ontology where the nature of social reality and the social and material conditions that exist have arisen from the configuration of power that is generally unequal. We have to be able to understand that. We have to see that the meaning is derived by unveiling the contradictions and hidden curriculum of official transcripts of society which perpetuate structures of inequality and social exclusion. In terms of methodologies, the study of social phenomena occurs through a decolonizing analysis. We need to look at the ways in which we're constructing knowledge that seeks to identify, expose, and challenge asymmetrical relations of power, that sustain social and material inequalities with the ultimate intent of social transformation. I mean, we have to believe that we can change the world. Otherwise, why are we doing this work? To me, it doesn't make any sense. So then part of what we have to understand as well is that we're always dealing with this tension between authority and freedom. There's another tension there at work. However, we need authority and we need freedom, and that in fact, Freire would say to us, it is not possible to have authority without freedom, or vice versa. That it is when they're working together, that in essence, often what gives us the greatest authority is when we have a way of being in the world where people feel safe with us, where they feel they can be themselves, and then and they feel they're able to be honest about who they are and what they're dealing with. That brings an enormous sense of authority to the person, not an authority that that person has, has banged somebody over the head with, or, but it's through their living and through their loving. We have to be myth busters. That's why I'm talking about epistemologies. There's so many myths going on. For example, we're dealing with myths that say that there's a classless society. Now, that is a lie. There's the myth of equality, the myth of social, all right, we must have done something. The myth of social mobility, and the myth of school choice. These are myths, and they're myths that we have to look at because they're myths that perpetuate the exclusion. We need to move beyond the cult of experts. I love this little piece. I'm sorry, it just feels so right. I had to include it. And what that says is that we need to rethink this notion and who is truly competent to work with students, with parents and communities dealing with issues of disabilities, where their lived experiences, sensibilities, and voices must be centered. When we look at, for example, the statistics on education in this country, we have to deal with the fact that still 80% of teachers across the country are white. How can you, and many are working in communities where it's 60, 80, up to 80%. In LA, we've got like 80% kids of color in the Unified School District, and we've got that kind of a ratio. There's a disparity there that we have to struggle with. And I'm not saying, where people say, well, what, does that mean that we can't teach? No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that if we truly want to work with children from different communities, people from those communities have to be involved in the conversation. They have to be involved in the practice. That's how we get educational structures that are effective. So all of this leads to really talking about this notion of cultural democratic context of inclusivity that requires intentional inclusion of people with different cultural views and ways of knowing, especially people who have traditionally lived at the margins of the organization and society and schools. Intentional and multidimensional theories, policies, and practices of inclusion cannot remain at the level of just rhetoric, but rather, and that's misspelled, must be reflected in the architecture, organization, structure, decision-making culture, and the design of participatory leadership. This then is the message, like one of the major pieces here is that we live in one world, one love, one community, and often when people see this, they think about it, oh, isn't that cute? This is like the hardest thing to do. The hardest thing is to remain a loving human being under conditions that are so tough at times to work with. And yet that's when love really, to me, that's when the power of love is most a force for change. And so I think that so much of what we've got to do, and I'm going to run really quick through these last pieces, is to bring this, to understand all oppression is interconnected. That we cannot be neutral about these issues. We cannot be neutral about exclusion. This is a quote from Desmond Tutu. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, then you've chosen the side of the oppressor. There is no neutrality when it comes to issues of oppression, exclusion of human beings. I want to tell you this work is personal for me. So as I stand before you as a grandmother of Jessica Antonia Stephan, who was born with Gordon syndrome, which means, some of you may know, but she was born with a syndrome where her bones do not grow evenly. So she has scoliosis, severe scoliosis. Her little legs are uneven. She can't quite, we can do this. She can't. this is about as far as she can go. She was born with a cleft palate. This child, she just turned 20, has had 22 surgeries. And that wasn't, it didn't happen to an individual. This happened to us as her family and her community. We all experience this. And I think that that's what I think that it's important for us to make our work personal, to know what our purpose, why are we doing this work? Why are we here? Why do we get up? And if it's just to make a living, oh my God, there's so many other ways that you can make a living. We need to be a living example of our politics. It always astounds me, Bell Hooks says, when progressive people act as though it is somehow a naive moral position to believe that our lives must be a living example of our politics. It's not about going into a classroom. It's not about doing policy. It's about, can we live? Can we live truly a pedagogy of love? Freire asked us to dare to risk. For us to learn is to construct, to reconstruct, to observe with a view to changing, none of which can be done without being open to risk, to the adventure of the spirit. And an incredible woman, Grace Lee Boggs, who was an activist, who was a philosopher, she said, we are at one of the great turning points in human history when the survival of our planet and our restoration of our humanity requires a great sea of change. And in this change, we must be willing then to do something incredible, something incomprehensible, because sometimes the change we need is a change that we can't comprehend right at this moment, because it has to look different. It has to feel different. It has to be different in our work. And I'll end with Bishop Desmond Tutu when he said, do a little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits put together that overwhelm the world. And so the call to you is, let's overwhelm the world. Let's overwhelm the world with our brilliance, with our intelligence, with our commitment, and with our love. Thank you.